Hi, welcome back to another night at the museum. I'm Professor Toby Ault. I'm a climate scientist at Cornell University. And tonight's lecture is going to look at what happened to the early Earth's atmosphere when a new innovation by life itself, started to modify the atmosphere and cause some pretty disruptive positive feedbacks that ultimately led to cooling. And to get started, I'll tell you the story of Sir Douglas Mawson, because he was really the first geologist to talk about these quote unquote snowball Earth episodes. And the reason why he is a credible source on snowball Earth and glacial deposits, initially at least, is because he was part of an ill-fated Antarctic expedition. He's an Australian geologist, left in late 1911, and had this novel idea that they would put a radio relay station up between the base camp that they intended to put on Antarctica and Australia. They would have a relay station on Macquarie Island, which is about halfway between Australia and Antarctica. So they stopped at Macquarie Island, which is a pretty extreme place in and of itself. Then made it down to Denison Bay, which, as it turns out, we know now is one of the windiest places in the world. Spent several months there, the wintertime in Australia, and then got started all the way in the following austral spring, in November of 1912. Mawson set out with two other explorers. Their names were Xavier Mertz and Lieutenant Belgrave Ninnis. Xavier Mertz was an accomplished skier, and Ninnis was a soldier. And they set out on what was called the eastern, to explore east of the camp. And they are going along fine for about 5 weeks. And they start encountering, and they've been encountering them all along, but they're encountering these crevices, huge, massive crevices, bigger than this room and hundreds of feet deep. And some of them have a very brittle shell of snow concealing them. And so, to be careful, they're spaced out so their weight is distributed between the three members of the party. And Mawson chooses to go second because that's hypothetically the most dangerous position, because the first person to go over it might loosen it, the second person could fall through. They don't know that they've crossed one. They look back, and Ninnis and the sled is nowhere to be seen. They go back and they find a huge hole has broken open in above one of these crevices. Ninnis is nowhere to be found. They shout for him for hours. All they can see is one of the dogs from the sledge on a cliff a few dozens of feet below them. And they call and they call and they can't find him. And eventually they have to move on, and they have to turn back because Ninnis was carrying the majority of their food. So they turn back, and now they have to survive on the dogs themselves. So they use the dogs to pull them around, and then they have to consume the dogs. They run out of dogs to consume. They're still like more than 100 miles away from the base camp. And Mertz, the athlete, the skier, starts to just completely break down. And it's thought that probably Mertz had consumed the dog's liver and experienced vitamin A poisoning, but he's no longer capable. Starts to thrash and flail about, destroys one of the tent poles, almost destroys the tent itself. It's protecting him from the Antarctic winds. And Mawson has to sit on his chest to just immobilize him, and eventually Mertz passes away. And so now it's just Mawson. And he still has like 100 miles to go. And he has very little food and makes very slow incremental progress. And he wrote in his journal that the only thing motivating him was not really the hope of his survival, but just the idea that if he could get closer to the base, then at least he could cache his diaries and people would know what happened to his expedition. He himself eventually breaks through one of these crevasses, falls, pulls the sledge with him. The sledge anchors him in a way, keeps him from falling even farther down. So he's dangling from this rope in a crevice, climbs his way back up, falls back down again. Feels like this is the end. He has almost no ability or strength or will to make it out of there. And he remembers this poem by Robert Service from when he was a kid, I think. He was younger. And it says something to the effect of, it's easy to die. It's the keeping on living that's hard. It's dead easy to die. It's the keeping on living that's hard. He repeats this to himself again and again, finds his way out, makes it back to the camp. He's trying to get back in time for the ship that's going to leave in austral summer to take him back to Australia. And he misses it by 5 hours. He has to spend another winter in Antarctica. And during that time, initially they've got radio contact through this relay station that they set up. But unfortunately, the radio operator, a very specialized position at the time, has a detachment from reality, psychological break from reality, and oscillates between being paranoid, thinking that the rest of the crew is trying to kill him, and trying to murder the rest of the crew. And so they have to keep him under 24-hour supervision for that entire second winter in Antarctica. And they can't use the radio to communicate with Australia. Makes it back, and he's celebrated as a hero. And later in his career, he documented what were important deposits for our understanding of these early Snowball Earth episodes. I said he's a credible source, having spent so much time in such a cold and glacially riddled place. And what he found in Australia were these formations called drop stones. And we've got one just outside our building on campus at Cornell. So a drop stone is a deposit of a piece of rock that's been rafted there from some other latitude. And you know that it didn't get transported by rivers. You know that it didn't fall off of a cliff nearby, because these deposits are found in ocean sediments in the open ocean. So it had to have been transported there from some source. And Mawson correctly reasoned that that source must have been ice sheets, or there must have been ice sheets in that vicinity, sea ice in that vicinity, that was depositing these drop stones. Now, it turns out what he didn't know about at the time was not at all mainstream as it is now, was plate tectonics. So Australia was closer to the poles in the past. But what Mawson coined was this phrase called Snowball Earth. He hypothesized that even areas like Australia were once covered in ice and sea ice. And that seems to have played out. He just got some of the details wrong because he didn't know about plate tectonics. There's another interesting phenomenon that's happening around the same time in the early Earth's history. We're talking about 2.4 billions of years ago. And that's these banded iron formations. So banded iron formations have, as you might expect, a ton of iron, lots of iron in them. You can take a magnet and it'll stick to them. In fact, there's one, you go look, right when we first came down the ramp here at the museum, there's a banded iron formation. You can stick a magnet to it, it'll say there's enough iron. But it's these alternating layers of a more rust-colored form of iron from a time when there was oxygen in the oceans. The iron reacted with that oxygen and precipitated out, forming deposits on the ocean floor. And other layers interspersed with those rust-colored layers that are much less rich in iron, and they correspond to periods in the Earth's history with less dissolved oxygen. Before we get into how these snowball Earth episodes, these drop stones, these banded iron formations are potentially linked to the role of life and to the role of photosynthesis, I want to just review the faint young sun paradox, which states that if the greenhouse effect were the same as it is today, the Earth should have been frozen over. And the reasoning is that the greenhouse effect now just isn't strong enough to support liquid oceans on the surface. And yet there's abundant evidence through time, billions of years ago, of liquid oceans. And while that is a paradox, there are in fact times when the Earth does appear to have been frozen over. And some of these episodes, these snowball Earth episodes, occurred suspiciously close to geologic window of time called the Great Oxidation Event, about 2.5, 2.4 billions of years ago. Before that time, there was almost no oxygen in the atmosphere, less than 1%. After that, oxygen levels start to increase gradually, but it would be another hundreds of millions of years before there was enough oxygen in the atmosphere for any of us to breathe it. So if you went back to most of Earth's history, you could not have breathed the atmosphere. And at 2.5 billion years, start to see widespread evidence of enough oxygen in the atmosphere to start reacting with rocks and forming new minerals. And this is when oxygenic bacteria, algae, technically they're cyanobacteria, so they're like a more primitive version, earlier version, a beta release of algae. They're doing photosynthesis. So there's this new innovation of unicellular life in the oceans that's able to take sunlight, dissolve CO2 in the water, and make its own energy. The catch is the way that we've typically thought to resolve the faint young sun paradox is by expecting that there must have been much more methane in the atmosphere of the early Earth. And that's very plausible because before the Great Oxidation Event, methane could have persisted in the atmosphere for much longer than it does now because it wouldn't have had anything to react with. Eventually, it would have probably escaped from the effects of solar wind, but even the Earth's magnetic shield would have protected it from that. So methane in the atmosphere would have been very stable before the Great Oxidation Event. And methane is a greenhouse gas, a potent greenhouse gas. The reasoning goes, once oxygenic bacteria start making this new form of quote unquote pollution, the oxygen itself in the atmosphere begins to react with the methane to create water vapor and CO2. Well, CO2 is not as potent of a greenhouse gas as methane is. And so by reacting away the methane in the atmosphere, you weaken the greenhouse effect and you set up a whole cascade of positive feedbacks that result in cooling. So let's walk through what that might have looked like. Oxygenic bacteria make oxygen. It's their job. That's what they do. That's their thing. It reacts with the methane. The greenhouse effect is weakened. So now there's less energy being trapped near the surface. That means at the high latitudes, at the polar regions initially, you can have more sea ice. Sea ice is much more reflective than ocean water because it's much more reflective. Less energy enters the whole climate system because it modifies Earth's albedo. It increases Earth's albedo and reflects more sunlight out to space. With less energy for the climate system, you get additional cooling. With additional cooling, you have less water vapor in the atmosphere. Water vapor is also a potent greenhouse gas. This leads to additional cooling. And over time, over millions, or you don't really have tight time constraints, but we'll say millions, maybe hundreds of thousands, or maybe faster, thousands of years. The cooling has almost like the opposite effect of the runaway greenhouse effect that we talked about last time on Venus. It's almost like a runaway cooling effect from these positive feedbacks that reflect more sunlight, cause additional cooling, and eventually add up to ice and sea ice being present even in equatorial regions. And now, how do you get out of it? Do you ever leave one of these Snowball Earth episodes? Well, again, we have to invoke positive feedbacks. And Pierre Humbert in the reading, if you've done the reading for this class, not, I'll walk you through the hypothesis that he talks about. The volcanic activity, plate tectonics, and vents in the deep ocean, the seafloor, would have still allowed plenty of CO2 to escape into the atmosphere and bubble up through the ice sheets. And without a lot of oxygenic bacteria, you wouldn't do anything with that CO2. It would just sit there. And it would work as a greenhouse gas and start to warm the oceans initially near the equator, resulting in less sea ice. Less sea ice would then mean more energy from the sun is absorbed. More energy from the sun absorbed would result in more warming in the oceans. Could result in more water vapor, which is a greenhouse gas, accelerate that warming. There's still plenty of CO2 in the atmosphere. We retreat from one of these Snowball Earth episodes. Over the course, again, we're talking millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of years. And these episodes themselves lasted tens to maybe hundreds of millions of years. But in both cases, there are positive feedbacks. Even though one results in cooling, the other results in warming, they're both considered positive feedbacks because they amplify the initial temperature change. Why is any of this relevant for today? Well, first of all, it tells us about tipping points and thresholds that we might need to think about, we might need to worry about in the climate system. And particularly as we move into a warmer and warmer climate, where there is very serious policy and scientific discussion around the idea not only of removing CO2 from the atmosphere artificially, but of using aerosols to block out solar radiation, to block sunlight, to cool the planet, to buy ourselves more time to deal with the greenhouse gas problem. Now, these are huge political, ethical, scientific, moral debates. But stories like this one about Snowball Earth are an important reminder that there can be thresholds or runaway effects that once you tip the system in a certain direction, whether it's towards warming or towards cooling, positive feedbacks can take over and become very nonlinear and accelerate and exacerbate that initial warming. It's an important feature of the planet to be aware of when we think about how we're going to build and sustain a habitable climate system, a stable climate system during this century. Thank you.